Why was everyone staring at the medic instead of the wounded man? The firefight in the mountains of Kunar province had burned itself out the way storms sometimes do, suddenly, leaving behind a strange quiet. Smoke drifted across broken stone walls. The metallic smell of gunpowder hung in the cold Afghan night. Men who had been shooting seconds earlier were now checking themselves for wounds they hadn't yet felt. And in the middle of that silence, a woman knelt in the dirt. She was small, barely 5'3". Her uniform was torn at the shoulder. Blood covered both of her hands. Not her blood. With one hand, she pressed a trauma dressing into a wound in a SEAL's upper thigh. With the other, she held a rifle aimed steadily toward the doorway across the courtyard. Her voice was calm, quiet, almost gentle. "Pressure's holding. You're going to be fine." 3 hardened operators stood nearby watching her. Big men, veterans of places whose names never appeared in newspapers. They weren't watching the wound. They were watching her. Footsteps approached through the smoke. Lieutenant Commander Garrett Voss stepped forward, a man whose career had spanned nearly 2 decades of special operations. He had been decorated by generals, briefed by senators. But now he stopped 3 feet in front of the medic. He studied her in silence. She never looked up. She simply kept working. Then slowly, Voss straightened his spine and raised his hand in a formal salute. To her, the courtyard froze. 8 silent seconds passed before he lowered his hand. That moment had taken 8 years to reach. It began in a quiet town outside Fort Bragg. Sloane Harker grew up in a place where helicopters were part of the morning sky and every neighborhood understood the weight of deployment schedules. Her father, Daniel Harker, was Special Forces, quiet, observant, the kind of man who noticed exits and shadows before anyone else did. He began teaching Sloane to shoot when she was 10. Not because he expected her to fight. Because he believed competence was the greatest form of protection. Every Saturday they drove to a field south of town before sunrise. Daniel never rushed her, never raised his voice. "Slow," he would say. "Steady." "Sure." The words were carved into the underside of his old Remington rifle. Sloane repeated them until they felt like breathing. Then, in October 2001, a man in uniform knocked on the door. Her father had been killed in Afghanistan. Details classified. Sloane was 18. She didn't touch a rifle for 2 years. Instead, she enlisted in the Navy and trained as a combat medic. Saving lives felt like the only promise she could make her mother. And she kept that promise for 6 years. Until the Navy sent her to Afghanistan. The base at Bagram Airfield looked temporary in the way all war zones do, structures built quickly, patched repeatedly, never meant to last. Sloane arrived with a duffel bag, a medical kit, and orders assigning her to support a SEAL team operating near the Pakistani border. SEAL Team 3. The briefing room smelled like coffee and insulation foam. 4 men looked up when she walked in. Senior Chief Decker Rains glanced at her paperwork, then at her. "You're the new medic." "Yes, Senior Chief." He set the folder down. "Last thing we need out here is a babysitter." Sloane didn't react. She simply asked, "What's your blood type?" Rains blinked. "B positive." "Good to know." Across the room, the team's sniper Cullen Shaw watched quietly. He noticed something no one else did. During the briefing, when Rains placed his rifle on the table, Sloane's hand twitched slightly, as if muscle memory had almost reached for it before she stopped herself. Shaw filed that away. 3 days later, the team moved into the mountains for reconnaissance. The terrain was brutal, rocky slopes that punished every step. The air grew thinner as they climbed. Temperatures dropped sharply after sunset. Sloane kept pace without complaint. She also noticed things. Ward McCreary, The team's explosive specialist developed a headache during a rest halt. Sloan crouched beside him and spoke quietly. "How long?" "Since morning." "Drink this." Hydration salts. An hour later, the headache vanished. Raines developed a fever the next day. Sloan handed him antibiotics without ceremony. "Left calf abrasion. It's infected." He checked. She was right. That night Sloan spotted movement along a ridge that the intelligence briefing had labeled unlikely. 14 men traveling a hidden route through the mountains. She reported it calmly. Voss studied her afterward. "Good eyes, Harker." It was the first time he used her name. But none of them yet understood who she really was. And somewhere far away, someone already knew. Because the mission hadn't been built around the enemy. It had been built around her. The question was why? And that answer was waiting deeper in the mountains. Why had the ambush been timed so perfectly? The gunfire came from below the ridge line without warning. 3 rifles opened up in quick succession, rounds cracking through the air with the sharp violence that turns quiet mountains into chaos. The SEALs reacted instantly, dropping to cover. Sloan didn't freeze. She grabbed McCreary's vest and dragged him behind a rock formation before the second burst arrived. The movement was fast and precise, as if she had rehearsed it 100 times. McCreary blinked at her. "Where'd you learn to move like that?" She didn't answer. Instead, she listened. Gunfire patterns told stories. Nervous shooters fired short bursts. Experienced ones controlled their rhythm. The first burst had been short. The second came exactly when she expected it. 4 minutes later, the ambush ended. The shooters withdrew, leaving only echoes in the valley. No casualties. But as they moved out, Raines walked beside her. "You pulled McCreary before the second burst." "Yes." "How'd you know it was coming?" "First burst was short," she said calmly. "Nervous shooter." He walked in silence for several steps. "Where'd you learn that?" "My father." That night Voss stepped outside their position and made a quiet satellite call. "She's operational," he said. A voice on the other end asked one question. "Does she know yet?" Voss looked back toward the team. "No." The truth was simple. Sloan Harker wasn't just a medic. And the man responsible for her father's death was somewhere in these mountains. 2 days later, the team returned to base. A message waited for them. Conference Room C, 1800 hours. Inside the room sat a civilian man with an unremarkable face and a thin folder. He placed 3 photographs on the table. The man in the images was older, gray hair, heavyset. "Viktor Volkov," the civilian said, "former KGB, now an intelligence broker." Volkov was carrying a list of American intelligence assets operating across Central Asia. If that list reached the wrong buyer, dozens of covert operatives would die. Raines leaned forward. "You want us to intercept him?" "No." The civilian's answer hung in the air. "Terminate." Sloan studied the photograph. Something about the man's posture caught her attention. The way he sat. The way he watched people. A handler's gaze. She turned the photograph face down. Only Shaw noticed. Because there was something no one else in that room knew. Years earlier, Volkov had managed a deep-cover American asset in Central Asia. That asset's code name had been Harker 7. His real name was Daniel Harker, Sloan's father. And somewhere in those mountains was the man who knew exactly how he died. The operation began 48 hours later. The team approached the exchange point under darkness. Shaw established a sniper overwatch on a ridge above the stone building where Volkov waited. Thermal optics confirmed him inside. Everything was ready. Then the unexpected happened. A single rifle shot cracked through the valley. Shaw grunted in pain. "Overwatch down," he said calmly over the radio. "Shoulder hit." The team froze. Without Overwatch, they were blind. And Volkov was seconds from completing the exchange. Voss's voice came through Sloane's headset. "Harker, can you take the shot?" The distance was 760 yards. Wind from the northeast. 11 knots. She had already calculated it earlier, without realizing why. Because that was how her mind worked. She unzipped the lower compartment of her pack. Inside was a Macmillan TAC-338 rifle. The SEALs watched silently as she assembled it in under a minute. Rain stared. The medic settled behind the rifle. Through the scope, she saw Volkov being pulled toward the building entrance by a bodyguard. She controlled her breathing. 4 seconds in. 7 seconds hold. 8 seconds out. Her father's rhythm. She fired. The bullet struck stone inches from the doorway. She didn't react. She simply recalculated. The wind had shifted. She adjusted. Waited. Fired again. The bodyguard dropped instantly. Volkov collapsed behind cover. Behind her, the SEALs exchanged stunned glances. The medic calmly disassembled the rifle. "We need to move," she said. No one argued. But something inside the team had shifted. Because the quiet medic they had underestimated wasn't just saving lives. She had just taken one from nearly half a mile away. And the mission had suddenly become something else entirely. Why had the signal been sent 6 days earlier? Sloane had noticed it buried deep in the SATCOM logs, an 11-second transmission on an unassigned frequency. She recognized the signal pattern. Taliban coordination channels. The device ID belonged to someone on the team. Senior Chief Decker Rains. She didn't report it. Not yet. Because suspicion wasn't enough. She needed certainty. And certainty arrived inside a stone building in the mountains. When Rains stepped away from the group and spoke quietly into a personal communicator, Sloane saw everything she needed. Later, inside the building where Volkov had been captured, she walked to the doorway. "Senior Chief." He turned. She held up the frequency scanner. Signal transmitted 6 days ago and 20 seconds ago. He stared at the display. For 3 seconds the room was silent. Then a rifle shot shattered the doorway. The bullet destroyed the device in his hand without touching him. Shaw's voice came over the radio. "Device neutralized." Rains looked at Sloane. Then at Voss. And he understood the running was over. Voss walked toward Sloane and handed her a brown envelope he had carried for months. Inside was a declassified CIA report. Daniel Harker, operational compromise confirmed. Cause, internal communication breach. Below the typed report were 4 handwritten words. "I tried to warn him." Sloane folded the document slowly. "Where Volkov?" she asked. Voss pointed to the next room. "Then we need to move." Because now the mission wasn't just about stopping a traitor. It was about the truth behind a father's death. And the woman who had waited 8 years to face it. What does a person do when the truth finally stands in front of them? The mountains of Kunar held the night like a heavy blanket. Wind slid down the high passes in uneven breaths, and between those breaths there was a silence so complete that every step seemed louder than it should be. Sloane Harker moved through that darkness with quiet certainty. 3 men followed her. They didn't ask where she was going. They simply trusted that she knew. Ahead of them, somewhere in the valley, Senior Chief Decker Rains was running. Running toward the exchange point, where Viktor Volkov's contact waited. running to finish what he had started years earlier. Sloane knew how he would move. She had watched him long enough to understand the rhythm of his stride, the way he favored his left ankle, the routes he preferred through uneven terrain. There was a narrow draw on the north side of the valley, a tight cut in the rock that shaved minutes off the approach. Most people would miss it. Sloane hadn't. She slipped into it without slowing. The rock walls closed in around her shoulders as she angled sideways through the narrow passage. Behind her the others followed, boots scraping stone in controlled silence. 8 minutes. That was how much time the shortcut saved. 8 minutes could change everything. When they emerged onto a rocky shelf above the exchange point, the building below came into view. Old stone walls. 2 doors. 3 windows. 4 armed guards circling the perimeter. And 60 meters away, approaching from the south. Rains. Sloane raised a fist. Everyone froze. She studied the scene for 20 seconds. Angles. Cover. Light. Wind. Then she spoke quietly. Shaw takes the shelf, cover the perimeter. The wounded sniper nodded and crawled into position. McCreary breach charge east wall, small flash. He was already unpacking the explosive. Voss enters north door. The commander watched her carefully. And you, he asked. South entrance. He didn't question it, because the south entrance was exactly where Rains was headed. 90 seconds later the breach charge detonated. A bright flash lit the eastern wall. Guards turned instinctively toward the blast. Inside the building someone shouted. Rains sprinted through the south door. And stopped. 2 meters inside the doorway stood Sloane Harker. Her sidearm pointed directly at his chest. For a moment neither of them spoke. Footsteps thundered inside the building as Voss and McCreary cleared the interior rooms. Shouts, commands, boots scraping across stone. Then silence returned. Rains looked at the weapon. Then at Sloane. I knew, she said. He breathed slowly. Went. 6 days ago, SATCOM logs. He almost smiled. And you waited. Reporting it ended the mission, she said quietly. Not reporting it ended you. Voss stepped into the room behind her, weapon raised. McCreary covered the door. Rains looked around at them. Understanding settled across his face. The whole time, he murmured. The whole time, Sloane confirmed. She didn't sound angry. She sounded finished. My father's name was Daniel Harker. The words hung in the air. Rains didn't flinch. He died in 2001, she continued, because someone leaked his location. Voss said nothing. Neither did McCreary. Sloane's eyes never left Rains. I read the file years ago. The source was redacted, but the contact date was. She stepped closer. 1999. The year you were assigned to the same advisory unit as my father. For the first time, something cracked in Rains' composure. He exhaled slowly. I tried to warn him. Sloane said nothing. The Russians had already compromised the network, Rains continued quietly. I was feeding intel to them, but when I realized Harker was the target. His voice trailed off. I sent a warning. Too late, Sloane said. He nodded. Too late. Silence stretched across the room. Finally, Rains looked directly at her. So what happens now? Sloane lowered her weapon slightly. But she didn't holster it. You finished the mission, she said. Outside, the wind moved through the valley again. Somewhere in the building Viktor Volkov sat quietly, waiting. Because he knew something the others did not. And Sloane Harker was about to hear it. Why would the enemy warn the man he was supposed to betray? Viktor Volkov sat calmly at a wooden table in the back room of the stone building. When Sloane entered, he looked up slowly. His eyes settled on her face. Recognition flickered there. "Daniel Harker's daughter," he said softly. The room went still. Sloane stepped closer. "You knew him?" "Yes." Volkov leaned back slightly, studying her with quiet curiosity. "Your father was the best operative I ever handled." The word stung. "Handled?" Sloane's voice stayed steady. "He died because someone leaked his position." Volkov shook his head slowly. "No." Everyone in the room froze. "He died because someone inside your intelligence service betrayed him," Volkov continued. Raines looked down. Sloane's heartbeat slowed. "You tried to warn him," she said. Volkov nodded. "Yes." "Why?" The Russian shrugged slightly. "Because your father believed in something." He leaned forward. "Men like that are rare." For a moment the room was silent, except for the wind brushing against the stone walls. Then Sloane stepped back. The mission was complete. The traitor was exposed. The truth had finally been spoken aloud. Hours later, back in the courtyard where the firefight had ended, Sloane knelt beside the wounded SEAL and pressed a dressing into place. Her hands were steady. The man's breathing slowed. Nearby, the operators watched her quietly. Lieutenant Commander Garrett Voss stepped forward. He studied the medic who had saved lives, taken a shot at 760 yards, exposed a traitor, and faced the truth about her father without breaking. Then he straightened his spine and saluted her. 8 silent seconds passed. No one spoke, because some moments don't belong in official reports. They happen in the dark, in the dust, between gunfire and silence. And sometimes dignity doesn't raise its voice. Sometimes it simply acts. Why did the room go quiet the moment she sat down? Not silent in the polite way meetings sometimes pause. Silent in the way a room changes when something unfamiliar enters it. Sloane Harker felt it immediately. 4 men, a briefing table scarred by years of maps and rifle stocks, coffee that had been reheated too many times, and the particular stillness that lives inside special operations units, the kind built from discipline, caution, and experience. She was 26, the lowest-ranking person in the room, and the only medic. Lieutenant Commander Garrett Voss sat at the head of the table, reading her file longer than necessary. His face did not change much when he looked up, but Sloane noticed the details. The slight narrowing of the eyes, the way his fingers stopped moving. A man calculating. Across from her sat Senior Chief Decker Raines. He was large in the way certain men become large through presence rather than height. 14 years in the teams, 2 bronze stars, the quiet confidence of someone who had survived enough missions to trust his instincts more than paperwork. He leaned back in his chair and studied her. Not rudely, just honestly. "You're the new medic," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Senior Chief." He glanced at her file again, closed it, set it aside. "Last thing we need out here," he said calmly, "is a babysitter job." The comment hung in the air. Ward McCreary, the ordnance specialist everyone called Pilgrim, shifted slightly in his seat. The team's sniper, Chief Cullen Shaw, didn't move at all. He stood against the far wall with his arms crossed, watching. Sloane felt the weight of their judgment. Not hostile, just certain. She had seen that look before. It said the same thing every time. She doesn't belong here. But Sloane didn't react. Didn't stiffen, didn't argue. She simply tilted her head slightly and asked one quiet question. "What's your blood type, Senior Chief?" Raines blinked. "B positive," he answered automatically. Good to know. And that was it. No challenge, no attitude. She turned and sat down. For a moment, nobody spoke. Pilgrim finally broke the silence with a small grin and extended his hand. "Ward McCreary," he said, "good to have you, Doc." She shook it. "I'm not Doc yet." He shrugged. "You will be." Across the room, Cullen Shaw continued watching her. He hadn't missed the exchange, or the way she handled it. Not defensive, not submissive, just precise, like someone moving pieces on a chessboard. The briefing continued. Maps spread across the table, intelligence updates, movement patterns in the eastern provinces, Taliban logistics routes threading through the mountains like veins. Sloane listened without writing anything down. Not because she wasn't paying attention, because she didn't need to. Her memory worked differently than most people's. Words stayed where they were placed. Coordinates attached themselves to images. Patterns formed quickly in her mind. Her father had noticed that when she was young. Some people memorize, he once told her on a cold Saturday morning at the shooting range. You understand. She pushed the memory away. Focus on the room. Commander Voss outlined their operational zone in Kunar province. 3 villages, 1 supply corridor, a network of compounds used by insurgent facilitators moving weapons through the mountains. Routine work for a SEAL team. Unpredictable terrain. Thin air. And enemies who knew every ridge better than any satellite. Rains leaned forward over the map. Intel says they've been staging fighters near the eastern ridge, he said. If they're preparing an ambush, that's where it'll come from. Voss nodded. Which is why we'll approach from the south. Sloane followed the map in silence. Then something subtle happened. Rains set his rifle down on the table as he reached for a marker. A normal movement. Except Sloane's right hand twitched. Just slightly. 2 fingers lifted before settling back into her lap. It lasted less than half a second. Almost invisible. But Cullen Shaw saw it. His eyes narrowed. Because he knew exactly what that movement meant. It was the beginning of a draw. The reflexive motion someone makes when their brain detects a weapon entering reach. Except Sloane hadn't finished the motion. She had stopped herself halfway. Shaw said nothing, but he filed it away. Later, when the briefing ended, the team began to disperse. Pilgrim headed for the motor pool. Rains grabbed his rifle and slung it across his shoulder. Shaw pushed off the wall. Sloane gathered her medical kit. As she turned toward the door, Rains spoke again. Medic. She paused. Yes, Senior Chief. He studied her carefully now. You ever worked with a SEAL team before? No. Combat zone? No. The room grew quiet again. Rains nodded slowly. Well, he said, that'll be a first for you then. There was no cruelty in his voice. Just realism. Afghanistan had a way of breaking people who arrived with impressive training records. Sloane understood what he meant. She also understood what he was really asking. Can you handle this? She met his eyes calmly. I was trained to keep people alive, she said. Rains held her gaze for another second. Then he nodded once and walked out. The door closed. Only Voss and Shaw remained in the room. Sloane picked up her bag. Dismissed, she asked. Voss studied her. Yes. She left. The door clicked shut behind her. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Shaw finally said what he'd been thinking. She noticed the rifle. Voss looked up. You saw that too. Half-draw reflex. Maybe. Shaw shook his head. Medics don't train that way. Voss leaned back in his chair. Outside, helicopters thundered somewhere over the mountains. People are more complicated than their files, he said quietly. Shaw didn't answer, because he was thinking about that tiny movement again. 2 fingers lifting, then stopping, like someone who had trained for something she wasn't supposed to remember anymore. Meanwhile, Sloane walked across the dusty airfield toward the barracks. The Afghan mountains loomed in the distance, dark blue against the evening sky. The wind carried the smell of fuel and stone. She paused for a moment, watching the ridgeline. A memory flickered in her mind. Her father standing behind her at the range, his hands adjusting the angle of the rifle stock against her shoulder. "Patience," he had said softly. "Good shooters don't rush." She blinked. The memory faded. 6 years she had kept that promise. 6 years without touching a rifle. She had come here to save lives. That was the deal she had made with herself. But as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, another thought quietly surfaced in the back of her mind. A thought she had buried for a long time. Some promises don't survive the places war takes you. And somewhere deep inside her, a part of Sloane Harker was beginning to wake up again. A part the team had not seen yet. Not the medic. Not the quiet woman at the briefing table. Something older. Something trained. And something that had been waiting, very patiently, for the right moment to step back into the light. Why did the sniper start watching her more closely after that meeting? Cullen Shaw had spent most of his adult life studying small movements. Breathing patterns, eye focus, the tension in someone's shoulders when a weapon enters a room, the tiny signals the human body gives before the mind catches up. Snipers survive by noticing things other people miss. And Sloane Harker had given him something strange. A half-draw reflex. Medics didn't train like that. Not the way her fingers had moved. Not the way they had stopped halfway, as if an old habit had been interrupted by a newer rule. So over the next few days, Shaw watched her. Not openly. Just quietly. The way hunters observe the edge of a field without stepping into it. Afghanistan in early spring had a deceptive calm to it. The mountains around Bagram looked peaceful in the morning light, gray stone and pale sky stretching for miles. But anyone who had worked in the region long enough understood something important. Stillness in war was rarely peace. Usually it was patience. SEAL Team 3 settled into their rotation quickly. Patrol schedules, intelligence briefings, equipment checks. Sloane moved through the routine like she had always been part of it. She checked medical supplies twice a day, repacked trauma kits with methodical care, learned the team's habits. Pilgrim liked to joke while he worked. Rain spoke rarely but watched everything. Shaw spent long periods in silence cleaning his rifle. And Commander Voss. Voss observed. He said little during the first week. But Sloane noticed. He often asked quiet questions that revealed how much he had already seen. "How fast can you stabilize a femoral bleed?" he asked her once during a gear check. "Under 90 seconds if I have direct access." "And if you do?" "2 minutes." Raines glanced at her. "That confident?" "No," she said calmly, "just practiced." Another day, during a patrol preparation, Pilgrim cut his hand on a jagged crate. Not badly. Just enough to bleed. Sloane crossed the room, cleaned the wound, wrapped it, and finished the job in about 30 seconds. Pilgrim looked impressed. "Fast hands, Doc." She shrugged slightly. "My father believed in practice." Shaw watched that exchange too. Because when she tied the bandage, her fingers moved the way experienced shooters move when adjusting optics. Precise. Controlled. Muscle memory. Something didn't fit. Then came the range day. Every unit needed one. Part training, part stress relief. They set up targets along a rocky slope outside the perimeter. Dusty wind sliding across the valley, while the distant thump of helicopters echoed somewhere beyond the mountains. Pilgrim fired first. Then Rains. Then Shaw. Their shots landed with the steady rhythm of men who had done this thousands of times. Sloan stood nearby, organizing medical supplies in case someone did something stupid. Pilgrim nudged her. "You shoot." She didn't look up. "Not anymore." "Not anymore," he repeated with a grin. "That means you used to." She zipped a pouch closed. "Yes." Rains overheard. "How long ago?" "A while." Pilgrim picked up an extra rifle and held it out. "Come on, Doc, one round." She hesitated, just long enough for Shaw to notice. The hesitation wasn't fear. It was something deeper. Conflict. Like someone standing in front of a door they promised never to open again. "No," she said finally. Pilgrim raised his hands. All right, all right." But Shaw stepped forward. "Try one." His voice was quiet. No pressure. Just curiosity. Sloan looked at him. The sniper's expression revealed nothing, just calm patience. The same patience he used waiting 12 hours for a single shot. The wind shifted across the range, dust lifting slowly off the ground. And something inside Sloan stirred again. A memory. Her father standing beside her on a field outside Fayetteville. The weight of a rifle balanced against her shoulder. "Breathe," he had said. "Don't fight the moment, let it settle." She exhaled slowly, then took the rifle from Pilgrim's hands. The team fell silent. Sloan stepped to the firing line. Her posture changed almost immediately. Not dramatically, just subtle adjustments. Feet placed slightly wider, shoulders relaxed, rifle stock pulled gently into the pocket of her shoulder. Shaw's eyes narrowed. There it is. That same controlled economy of movement. She raised the rifle, looked through the sights. The valley wind pushed softly against her sleeve. Then she lowered the weapon. "Safety off," she said calmly. Pilgrim blinked. Oh, he hadn't noticed. She raised the rifle again. One breath in, one breath out. The shot cracked across the valley. The steel target rang sharply. Dead center. Nobody spoke for a moment. Sloan lowered the rifle and handed it back. "Beginner's luck," Pilgrim said. Shaw walked downrange and inspected the target. The bullet hole sat almost perfectly inside the center circle. He returned slowly. "Not luck," he said quietly. Rains folded his arms. "How long since you shot?" Sloan thought about the answer. 2 years. Pilgrim nearly choked. 2 years. She nodded. Rains looked at Shaw. Shaw looked at Sloan. And for the first time since she arrived, something changed in the team's perception of her. Not fully. Not trust yet. But curiosity. Later that evening, as the sun dropped behind the mountains, Voss called a short meeting. Intel had changed. A suspected insurgent facilitator had been spotted moving through a small village northeast of their patrol zone. Not a major target, but someone worth watching. "Recon only," Voss said. "No engagement unless necessary." Rains nodded. Pilgrim checked equipment. Shaw prepared his rifle. And Sloan quietly packed her medical bag. As the team stepped out into the fading light, Shaw walked beside her. "You said you stopped shooting," he said. "Yes." "Why?" She didn't answer right away. The mountains were turning dark purple in the evening sky. Finally she spoke. My father was Special Forces. Shaw waited. He taught me everything he knew, she continued. What happened to him? Killed in Afghanistan. Shaw said nothing. That was a long time ago, she added. He studied her face. You still shoot like him. Sloane looked ahead at the trail, disappearing into the mountains. Some things, she said quietly, don't leave you. They walked the rest of the way in silence. But somewhere above them, hidden along the ridgeline, someone else was watching. Someone who had been waiting for the team to arrive. Someone who already knew one of their names. And far ahead, in the mountains of Kunar province, a chain of events had already started moving toward them. Events that would eventually lead to that strange moment in the smoke-filled building. The moment when a commander would stop in the middle of a battlefield and salute a medic kneeling in the dirt. But that moment was still days away. And none of them, not Shaw, not Voss, not even Sloane herself, understood yet how much this mission was about to change everything. Why did the air suddenly feel wrong the moment they entered the village? Not louder, not quieter, just wrong. Senior Chief Rains felt it first. Years in combat had trained his instincts to recognize invisible shifts, the kind that never showed up in mission briefings, the kind you felt in your chest before your mind could explain it. The village ahead sat quietly in the valley floor. Mud walls, small courtyards, goats wandering lazily near the irrigation ditch, smoke rising from cooking fires that smelled faintly of bread and wood. Normal life. Too normal. Rains raised a hand. The team stopped instantly. Behind him, Sloane adjusted the strap of her medical bag and scanned the rooftops. Shaw moved his rifle slowly along the ridge lines, his scope drifting across windows and doorways. Pilgrim crouched near a low wall. Quiet morning, he whispered. Rains didn't answer. Because quiet wasn't always safe. Sometimes quiet meant someone had already decided where you were going to die. Commander Voss stepped beside him. What do you see? Nothing. Voss nodded once. That's the problem. They moved again slowly. The path through the village narrowed between two tall clay walls. A few villagers watched from a distance, expressions neutral, unreadable. Sloane noticed the way their eyes moved. Not curious. Expectant. That feeling returned again. Wrong. Then Shaw spoke softly over the comms. Second roof, east side. Rains followed his line of sight. A shadow had shifted behind a low parapet. Too quick to confirm. Too slow to ignore. Rains signaled the team to spread. Just in case. And that was the moment the world exploded. The first gunshot cracked through the village like a whip. Then 3 more. Bullets slammed into the wall behind Pilgrim, spraying dust and fragments of clay across the alley. Contact. The word echoed in the narrow street. Shaw dropped to one knee and returned fire instantly, his rifle snapping toward the rooftop. The second shot silenced the shadow there. But it was already too late. Figures appeared along the ridgeline beyond the village. 6, maybe 8. Rifles raised. The trap had closed. Gunfire erupted from 3 directions. Rains grabbed Pilgrim by the vest and dragged him behind a stone well as rounds chewed into the ground around them. Ambush. Voss moved to the corner of the alley, firing controlled bursts toward the ridge. Sloane, stay low. She was already down, pressed against the wall. Heart racing, breathing steady, training taking over. Her mind shifted instantly from medic to survival. Not panic. Focus. The firefight intensified. Rounds ricocheted through the narrow street, Dust filled the air. Somewhere a goat screamed and bolted through the chaos. Shaw dropped another shooter along the ridge. But more were moving. Rains leaned out to return fire. And then it happened. The sound Sloane feared most. A sharp grunt. Rains collapsed back behind the well. His rifle clattered onto the stones. Blood spread quickly across his thigh. "Hit!" Pilgrim shouted. Sloane moved before anyone could call her. She slid across the ground beside him and grabbed his leg. The wound was bad. Entry near the femoral artery. Blood pumping fast. Too fast. Pilgrim's voice tightened. "Doc." "I see it," she said calmly. Her hands moved quickly. Gloves on. Tourniquet out. Pressure applied. The world narrowed into a single task. Stop the bleeding. Gunfire roared around them. But Sloane barely heard it. She focused on the rhythm of her own breathing. In. Out. Her father's voice echoed faintly in memory. Panic wastes time. The tourniquet tightened. Rains gasped. But the bleeding slowed. "Stay with me," she said quietly. He looked at her with surprising calm. "I'm not dying in a goat alley." "Good," she said, "because I'm not letting you." Across the street, Shaw continued firing toward the ridge. But the insurgents had advantage. High ground. Numbers. And patience. One of them fired an RPG from the hillside. The rocket slammed into the far end of the alley, exploding against a mud wall and sending a shockwave through the street. Pilgrim ducked. Jesus. Dust and smoke rolled across the village. Voss scanned the ridge again. "Too many," he said into the calm. "We need extraction." But the nearest support was 20 minutes away. Too far. Another burst of gunfire cracked through the alley. A round struck the stone edge beside Sloane's head. Fragments cut across her cheek. She didn't even flinch. Her focus remained on Rain's leg. Bleeding controlled. Pulse weak but steady. Good. But they were still trapped. Shaw dropped beside them briefly. "How bad?" "Stabilized," Sloane said. "But he can't walk." Rains grunted. "I've walked worse." "No," she said firmly. "You haven't." Shaw looked toward the ridge again. 3 shooters remained visible. And one more had moved closer along the rooftops. The angle was wrong. Too many blind spots. Then something unexpected happened. Sloane's eyes drifted toward a rifle lying on the ground beside Pilgrim. It had fallen during the explosion. Her gaze lingered there. Just for a moment. That old instinct stirred again. The one she had buried. Shaw noticed. "Don't," he said quietly. She looked at him. "I can cover you. You're the medic." "I know." Gunfire cracked again. Another bullet struck the well. Stone fragments scattered across the ground. Pilgrim cursed. "Guys, they're getting closer." Rains was growing pale now. Blood loss. Time was running out. Sloane made a decision. The kind people make when promises collide with reality. She reached for the rifle. Shaw's eyes narrowed. "You haven't done this in 2 years." She checked the magazine. "Some skills," she said softly, "don't fade." She rose slowly beside the well. Just high enough to see the ridgeline. The first insurgent appeared between 2 rocks. Sloane fired once. The man disappeared instantly. The second shot followed before anyone else moved. Another figure dropped behind the ridge. Shaw stared. That wasn't luck. That was training. Real training. Rains looked up at her through the haze of pain. "You said you were a medic." "I am." The third insurgent tried to reposition. Sloane fired again. Silence spread across the hillside. For a moment, even the gunfire stopped. Dust drifted slowly through the alley. Pilgrim blinked. "Doc." She lowered the rifle and returned to Rain's side. Her hands moved again to check the tourniquet. Back to being the medic. Back to the promise she made. But something had changed. The team saw it. Shaw said nothing. Voss simply watched her carefully. And Rains studied her with a new kind of respect. Because sometimes the person saving your life is more than what they appear to be. But the battle wasn't finished yet. Not even close. Because far above them, hidden deeper along the ridgeline, a final shooter had been waiting patiently, watching the medic who could shoot, watching the team that had survived the ambush. And slowly, he raised his rifle. Why did Sloane suddenly freeze in the middle of the alley? Not the kind of freezing that comes from fear. It was something else. A quiet, instinctive pause, the way a hunter stops moving when the forest goes silent. The gunfire had faded. 3 insurgents were down along the ridgeline. Dust drifted slowly through the village, settling across broken walls and scattered brass shells. The air smelled like burned powder and dry earth. For a moment, it looked like the ambush had ended. But Sloane's eyes were fixed on the ridge. Something wasn't right. Her hands still pressed against the tourniquet on Rain's leg, checking the pressure again, making sure the bleeding stayed under control. But her attention had shifted somewhere else entirely. She felt it. That strange, quiet pressure that sometimes comes before danger reveals itself. A memory stirred in her mind. Her father's voice again, low and patient at the firing range. After the shot, always wait. Someone else is watching. Sloane's breathing slowed. In. Out. The village felt too still. Shaw noticed the change first. He had been scanning the rooftops again when he saw Sloane's posture shift slightly. Her shoulders straightened. Her eyes narrowed toward the ridge as if she were looking through something invisible. "What is it?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer immediately. Then she spoke a single word. "Shooter." Pilgrim blinked. "Where?" Sloane lifted one hand slowly and pointed toward a rocky ledge higher along the ridge. "There." The others followed her gaze. At first they saw nothing. Just stone. Shadow. Then the smallest movement appeared between 2 boulders. A rifle barrel. The hidden insurgent had been waiting. Watching. Studying the battlefield long enough to recognize the real threat. Not the sniper. Not the commander. The medic who could shoot. The rifle flashed. The shot cracked through the valley. But Sloane had already moved. She dropped low and pulled Rains toward the well, just as the round shattered the stone where his head had been seconds earlier. "Sniper!" Pilgrim shouted. Shaw was already turning. His rifle snapped toward the ridge, but the angle was terrible. The shooter had chosen his position carefully, tucked deep between rocks with only a narrow window to fire from. Shaw fired once. The bullet struck stone. The insurgent fired again. The round hit the edge of the well, sending sharp fragments across Sloane's shoulder. She flinched but kept moving, dragging Rains deeper behind cover. Rains groaned. "You all right?" "I've had worse mornings," she said. But Shaw knew the situation had changed. The enemy sniper had patience. And patience in the mountains often meant death. He shifted position and tried another angle. Still no clean shot. "Too tight," he muttered. Pilgrim checked his magazine. "RPG the rocks." "Negative," Voss said instantly. "Rains is too close to the blast radius." Another shot cracked through the alley. This one struck the ground inches from Sloane's knee. The sniper was adjusting, learning their positions. Sloane's mind moved quickly now. She could feel the pattern forming, the rhythm between the sniper's shots, the slight delay as he repositioned for a clearer line of sight. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. Her father's lessons returned again. Good shooters don't rush. She looked at Shaw. "I need your rifle." He frowned. "No. I can see the angle." Still no. Another shot slammed into the well. Stone fragments cut across Sloane's sleeve. Pilgrim swore. "We can't stay here." Sloane met Shaw's eyes. "You have the better scope, let me try." Shaw hesitated. Not because he doubted her skill anymore, but because he knew exactly what she was about to attempt. And it was dangerous. One mistake, one slow movement, and the sniper would end it instantly. Sloane held his gaze. Calm, focused. Finally Shaw exhaled slowly. Then he handed her the rifle. 3 seconds, he said. She nodded. The weapon felt familiar the moment it touched her hands. Not comforting, just remembered. She adjusted the stock against her shoulder and leaned slightly toward the edge of the well. The world narrowed. Dust in the air. The smell of stone. Her own breathing. Somewhere far away, gunfire echoed from another valley. But here, everything had slowed down. She watched the ridge through Shaw's scope. A narrow gap between two rocks. That was the sniper's window. He would fire again. She could feel it. 3 seconds. 2. 1. The rifle barrel appeared. Sloane moved instantly. The shot came from the ridge at the same moment she rose from cover. The enemy round tore past her shoulder. Her rifle fired. One sharp crack. The echo rolled across the valley. Then silence. The barrel vanished. No second shot followed. Shaw slowly lifted his binoculars and scanned the ridge. A body lay slumped against the rocks. Still, the sniper was finished. Pilgrim let out a long breath. Doc. But Sloane had already lowered the rifle. Her hands trembled slightly now, not from fear, but from the sudden release of tension. She handed the rifle back to Shaw, then immediately returned to Rains, checking the tourniquet again. Back to being the medic. Like the moment had never happened. Rains looked at her carefully. You lied to us. Sloane shook her head. No. You said you stopped shooting. I did. Pilgrim stared. Then what was that? She paused for a moment, then answered quietly. Something I hoped I'd never need again. The distant sound of helicopters finally echoed through the mountains. Extraction. Help had arrived. But the team sat in silence for a few seconds longer. Because something important had changed in that dusty alley. The medic they had underestimated had just saved every one of their lives. Shaw finally spoke. You weren't just trained by your father. It wasn't a question. Sloane didn't answer. She simply finished securing Rain's bandage and looked up at the approaching helicopters. But deep inside her chest, another memory stirred. One she had never shared. Not with the team. Not with anyone. A training field years ago. Men in special forces, uniforms watching a teenage girl outshoot every soldier on the range. Her father standing beside them, quietly proud, and a commander saying words she had never forgotten. She's not just good, the man had said. She's exceptional. Back in the present, the helicopters roared closer. Dust spiraled through the village again. But the story wasn't finished yet. because what Sloan had done in that alley was only the beginning, the moment that would eventually lead to something far stranger. A battlefield filled with smoke, a wounded team, and a commander standing in silence, before slowly raising his hand in salute to a medic kneeling in the dirt. Why did the commander stop walking when he saw her kneeling in the dust? The helicopters had come and gone hours ago. Rains had been evacuated first, pale, weak, but alive. The tourniquet had done its job. By the time the medevac bird lifted into the sky, he was already arguing with the flight medic about how soon he could return to the team. Pilgrim had laughed. Guy loses half a liter of blood, and he's already planning his comeback. But once the rotors faded into the mountains, the valley felt different. Quieter, heavier. The team had remained behind to sweep the village and secure the ridge where the ambush had begun. Reinforcements arrived later, moving carefully through the rocky terrain, collecting weapons and intelligence from the fallen insurgents. But Sloan stayed near the well, near the place where the firefight had erupted, because there was still one man left alive. The youngest of the attackers, barely 20. A bullet from Shaw's rifle had torn through his shoulder, leaving him bleeding heavily against the broken wall of a courtyard. He had dropped his weapon long ago. Now he simply sat there, breathing unevenly, staring at the ground. Sloan knelt beside him. Her hands were steady again. The tremor from the sniper shot had passed. She cleaned the wound carefully, applying pressure, wrapping the bandage slowly. The young man winced but didn't resist. His eyes flickered toward her with confusion. Perhaps he expected anger or revenge, but there was none. Just quiet concentration. Pilgrim stood nearby, watching with his arms folded. You know he was trying to kill us 10 minutes ago. Sloan didn't look up. Yes. And you're patching him up anyway. Yes. Pilgrim exhaled. I'll never understand medics. Sloan tied the bandage and checked the bleeding. It had slowed enough to keep him alive. That was all that mattered. War doesn't decide who deserves help, she said quietly. Pilgrim didn't answer, because somewhere deep down he understood. A convoy of armored vehicles rolled slowly into the village an hour later. Command staff, intelligence officers, and the man who stepped out of the lead vehicle had a reputation that carried through every special operations unit in the region. Commander Daniel Mercer. He had spent 2 decades moving through conflicts across the world: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, the kind of places where decisions carried weight measured in lives. He walked through the village slowly, studying the aftermath of the ambush. The shattered wall, the crater left by the RPG, shell casings glinting in the dirt. Voss met him near the center of the alley. Rough morning, Mercer said calmly. Ambush, Voss replied. Your people handled it well. Voss nodded once. They did. Mercer glanced toward the ridge. 3 shooters up there. 4. Mercer raised an eyebrow. Your report mentioned a medic. Voss looked toward the courtyard. Sloan was still kneeling beside the wounded insurgent, adjusting the bandage and checking his pulse. She's the reason we're all still here, Voss said. Mercer studied her from a distance. Dust drifted through the courtyard, glowing softly in the late afternoon light. The young insurgent sat against the wall while Sloan finished securing the dressing. For a moment, the battlefield looked strangely peaceful. Mercer began walking toward her. Pilgrim noticed first. A doc. Sloan looked up. The approaching officer wore no visible rank on his combat uniform, but every soldier nearby straightened instinctively as he passed. Experience had a way of announcing itself. Mercer stopped a few feet away. He watched Sloane finish tying the bandage. Then he spoke. "You stabilized him." "Yes, sir. He'll live, if the infection stays away." Mercer nodded slowly. His eyes shifted briefly to the ridge beyond the village. "4 shooters," he said. "3 confirmed by your sniper." Sloane waited. Mercer looked directly at her now. The 4th was positioned behind a narrow rock gap with a high-angle firing lane. Her breath paused slightly, a detail very few people had noticed. "Yes, sir. And you neutralized him with a single shot." Sloane remained silent. Pilgrim's eyes widened slightly. Shaw watched from the edge of the courtyard. Mercer continued. "You did it while maintaining a tourniquet on your team leader." Still silence. The commander studied her face more carefully. "Not suspicious. Just curious." Then he asked a quiet question. "Who trained you, petty officer?" Sloane answered without hesitation. "My father, sir." Mercer nodded once. "What was his name?" She hesitated. "Just a moment." "Captain Robert Harker." Something shifted in Mercer's expression. Recognition. Not dramatic. Just a subtle pause. He looked back toward the ridge again, then down at the wounded insurgent, then finally back to Sloane. "Your father once trained a group of Special Forces recruits in Colorado," Mercer said quietly. Sloane's heart skipped once. "That's correct." Mercer's voice softened slightly. "I was one of them." The courtyard fell silent. Pilgrim blinked. Shaw's eyebrows lifted a fraction. Mercer studied Sloane for another long moment. "Your father used to say something," he continued. "He told us the best soldiers weren't the loud ones, not the strongest, not even the fastest." Sloane felt the memory rising before he spoke the words. "He said the best ones were the people who remembered why they were fighting." Mercer looked down at the wounded insurgent again, then at the medic kneeling in the dust, saving a life that had tried to take hers. Slowly, he straightened his posture. The courtyard remained completely silent as he raised his right hand and saluted her. Not loudly, not ceremonially, just a simple, quiet salute between soldiers who understood something deeper than rank. Sloane froze for a moment. Emotion rose unexpectedly in her chest. Pride, grief, something close to peace. Then she returned the salute. Across the courtyard, Pilgrim whispered under his breath, "Guess she's not just the medic." Shaw shook his head slowly. "No." Mercer lowered his hand. For a moment, he simply looked at Sloane with the calm respect of someone recognizing a story that had come full circle. Then he turned and walked back toward the convoy. The village slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. Soldiers resumed their work. Vehicles prepared to leave. But Sloane remained kneeling beside the wounded man for a few seconds longer, her hands resting gently against the bandage she had tied. The sun dipped lower behind the mountains, and in that fading light, one thought settled softly in her mind. Her father had been right all along. Strength wasn't always loud. Sometimes it looked like patience. Sometimes it looked like restraint. And sometimes it looked like a medic kneeling in the dust of a battlefield, choosing to save a life instead of taking one. Because in the end, courage isn't measured by how fiercely someone fights. It's measured by what they choose to protect. And sometimes the strongest soldiers are the ones who remember that dignity doesn't shout. It simply acts.